It's Kat, and yeah, I'm back. God forbid, right? Okay. Whoops. So, last video, this is part two of religion and how religion changes in the real world, what happens to it, and what might happen in Westeros. So, I talked about the different religions that were now in Westeros and throughout the rest of the Game of Thrones world. But I wanted to focus on Westeros and what changes might happen. So, I talked about in real history what happened to England, which is Westeros is very largely based on, and Henry VIII creating these reforms, or the first reforms to the Anglican Church, and he made himself the head, largely for selfish purposes, but it did actually have a much larger impact. And there was a second thing that was happening at the same time. The Gutenberg press was invented, and the Bible became the #1 printed and sold book across the world. And by the way, that's still true today. I don't know if you know that. #1 book across the world today is the Bible, printed in multiple languages. And so this was going on. This book was coming to England. Now, this is not the King James Version, by the way. So one of the things that you need to know was kind of impacting why there were Calvinists and Puritans and Baptists and other things that started to rise up after Henry VIII took control of the church, is that um, all the Bibles weren't uniform, right? So Henry VIII first tried to get one particular Bible printed. He had a small batch printed so he could distribute it, because he had some dudes come to him and say, hey, read this. And he started reading it for himself. And this is where he came up with some ideas about, I could get a divorce. Hey, I could do some other things. What is my right as the king? What actions should be taken? What's good and proper about taxes? Some other things like that. And so there was a lot more going on than, hey, I want a divorce. But there it was, Gutenberg Press. Now, what happens after that is that, well, Henry dies. Kind of like Robert Baratheon. He had some bad voodoo going on, some open ulcers in his legs. Baratheon, got bored by a gore. And gored by a boar. And, infection. And so these two dudes had been really healthy, athletic knights in the past, croaked from, becoming fat and overweight and etc. So when Henry VIII died, very much like Robert Baratheon, he had a young heir. His heir was Philip, or Edward VI. And Edward wasn't very robust. So you know that Henry VIII had Princess Mary with Catherine of Aragon. And when he divorced her, he made Princess Mary illegitimate. So she was now Lady Mary. And then he had Elizabeth with Anne Boleyn. And then when Anne Boleyn was, tried and convicted as a traitor and had her head cut off, he then had that marriage set aside, because he couldn't be married to a traitor. He was the king. And certainly not one with incest, and he didn't know who, and since he's claimed that was the claim, could he know for sure that Elizabeth was his daughter? Even though she looked like the freaking, Tudors and the Plantagenets with her red freaking hair, legally and in the eyes of the public, this is what he had to do. So now Elizabeth was a lady, and Philip came to the fore. Now here's the thing with Philip. Henry VIII's transition of religion was not complete. Okay, so the Anglican Church, as we think about it today, was still not totally formed or totally in charge, and there was a crap load of people who were definitely still Catholic and were kind of pissed off about the whole, thing with the divorce and Henry saying the Pope was no longer in charge. So while Edward VI is a young man, he has a privy council who basically runs the country for him during this time period. And they're kind of like slow mowing stuff. So this big change happened under Henry VIII, and then they slowed down real quick. And it's, the question is, Philip the Sixth, he's a Protestant, but he's not old enough to really recognize what he wants to do. And these other guys are just like, we just need to keep things calm because we have a minor king, and if crap breaks loose, we're back to the War of the freaking Roses and the War of Succession, right? There's even this sweet little letter that Elizabeth writes her younger brother about, hey, can I come and see you? You know, I want you to know that I'm a good Protestant girl, and I say my prayers, and I keep you in my prayers, blah, blah, blah. So there you go. And then Edward VI dies at the age of 16. Now there's a little succession problem, because Henry VIII had at one time considered making one of the princesses his heir, especially when it took so long for Edward VI to come along. But then he did, and he wasn't doing so well, so Henry VIII basically made a will or a law, a king's law, that said, you know, here's the order of succession should something happen. And this included the two girls with Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth. Now, that didn't exactly endear everybody in the country, because Mary was Catholic and Elizabeth was kind of Protestant. And there was starting to be bad feelings. You know, persecution was really taking off at this point. The Catholics against the Protestants, and the Protestants didn't like the Catholics. And this is down at the ground level, not even at the government level. So Mary comes in, and Mary, she's a devout Catholic. And quite frankly, this whole thing about her dad becoming the head of the church and divorcing her mom, and how terrible she thought it was, she never really got over that. So, you know, her deal was, you know what, this is a Catholic country. Most of the people here are Catholic. I'm a Catholic, and, you know, for thousands of years or hundreds of years, it's been Catholicism and the Pope in Rome. So that's what we're going to do. And of course, she was really concerned because Elizabeth was a Protestant, and there were all these Protestants out there, and every time they, you know, made some move or talked about some things and about her role in their persecution, she thought it meant that there was a plot underway to remove her from the throne. And so she seriously began prosecuting and persecuting all of these Protestants, and many went to the stake. It's not millions, by the way. In one particular period, there's thought to be about 235, but they were really public events. As a matter of fact, just a little quick aside, one of my ancestors, a Thomas Carman, he's in a book. Him and his son William were both burned at the stake. They were Baptist, and Mary, Bloody Queen Mary, ordered him burned at the stake. So Mary basically is purifying the church by fire. The whole or just bad things. She's burning people at the stake. And then, you know, Mary marries the Catholic Prince of Spain, the King of Spain. And now, though, even some of the Catholics that were supporting her were like, hold up a damn second. You know, we have been a sovereign, separate nation. We don't want the King of Spain to be the King of England as well, because, you know, at that time, if that happened, their son, whomever their son, if they had a son, would inherit the throne, and he would be both the King of England and the King of Spain. And so whatever politics were going on in Spain would start affecting England. And there's this whole thing about trade. There's the trade routes, you know, money. Oh, and there's that land over there in America, which we'll talk about that later with Yara and Theon, but we'll just keep on with the religion. So some of the Catholics were like, Mary, that might not have been such a great idea. Well, in the meantime, so she's imprisoned, Elizabeth, because she's pretty damn sure that that she's in on some plots, but she can't prove it. And there's this thing about beheading royal blood, because if you behead a prince or you behead another king or queen, what does that mean about you? You could be beheaded too. And there's some future in England about that. So, and think about that about Westeros. Ned was beheaded. Ned was a lord. He was the hand of the king, and he was beheaded. Ares II the Mad King, Jaime Lannister, killed him. You could kill a king. It was a shocking idea. You could kill a king if you were some other dude. All right? So, but at that time, Mary's like, everybody knows that if you kill a king or a queen or a princess, you might start off some bad precedent that would end with your own death. So she gets Elizabeth in the tower, and she's doing her bloody reign, and people are fleeing England. You know, all the different Protestant faith-based Congress. The churches are fleeing England. People are fleeing England. So we're about to come to the end of this part because Mary dies. After she's purified the church by fire, Mary dies, and Elizabeth is made Queen of England. And she's a Protestant.